The latest film in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise has dropped on Netflix. So let's talk about it. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a sequel to the original The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it continues the story 50 years later in the present day, and it ignores all of the previous sequels. Now, as a point of reference, prior to last month, I had never seen any of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre films. Though I live in Central Texas, where half the movies were shot, I'd never seen any of them before, and so over the last couple of months, I've done a deep dive into the franchise, watched all of the movies, watched a lot of the special features on each of the Blu-rays. In fact, I did such a deep dive that I actually went out to a bunch of shooting locations that are around the area where I live and shot some footage for my upcoming Texas Chainsaw Massacre ranking, as well as a vlog that will accompany it, and it might already be out and you can check it out right up here once it is finished. Real quick before I let you know my thoughts on the film, go ahead and dive into the comments section. Let me know, what did you think about the latest Texas Chainsaw Massacre film, and give us some context. Are you a big fan of the franchise? Was this is the first one in the series that you've watched? I'd love to hear your take on the film, and let's get started with the good. And as a point of reference, once again, going into this, I'm brand new to this franchise. I have no clue. I can't guess how the fan base of this franchise will react to the film. I dug this movie. And maybe it's because I really enjoy Fede Álvarez's take on the horror genre. I understand he didn't direct this movie, but he was a producer. He was the person that came up with the story. And the way that he takes these simple premises and kind of these confined spaces and have people trying to stealthily survive and then fighting back a little bit, I'm digging what he's doing. Once again, as a point of reference, I also really enjoyed Don't Breathe 2, another movie he didn't direct but was kind of part of his production company. I dug what that movie delivered, and perhaps that's just to say that these types of thrillers or horror thrillers are my thing, but this movie was my type of thing. Certainly a B movie. I'm not calling it a classic. It's not going to be in my top 10 of the year, not even close, but as some simple horror escapism, I enjoyed what this movie had to offer. Now, when it comes to the franchise, the original one was very much people just running for their life, trying not to die. This movie changes that up. It's less run for your life and turns into more fight for your life. Certainly doesn't have all the weirdness and creepiness of the original. It's much more about edge of your seat thrills. But I think it does a good job of delivering that type of experience because the movie does a good job with setup and payoff. And here's what I mean by that. The basic story here is a Texas Chainsaw Massacre film. So it is basic. It is very straightforward. A group of big city folk go into a small town, Leatherface gets triggered, and there's a massacre. But all along the way, I think it does a good job of setting up just little character arcs. It's not a character study. You're not going to be deeply moved by the transformation of these characters, but you're given just enough information about our lead characters' worldviews, as well as just enough backstory that when they make certain choices in the third act, it pays off that journey that they've been on. Likewise, all throughout the movie, we're introduced to little devices, elements that will help our characters survive, escape, or fight back. So when the massacre begins and our characters are in peril and jeopardy, we know what they're trying to get to and why. Therefore, as they're in that process and Leatherface does something or something else happens that gets in their way, you feel the tension because you understand the objective. And when they get there, when they make choices, when they obtain an item, when they get in a car, you feel that sense of satisfaction because it was properly established. You remembered it. There's actually a logic to the way things play out where people are trying to make choices in light of information. And because the story is simple enough, the audience themselves remembers all this information. So you start piecing together like, oh, they need to get over there. And if they're able to do this, I bet this will happen. And there were certainly points in time in the story where I was able to guess what was about to happen, but I would say it was in the good way. Like, if you just can predict the entire plot in the first 5 minutes, that's bad predictable. But if you're getting into these tense situations and you start piecing it together like, oh, I bet she's about to do this, that means they've actually set things up properly, so you're thinking like that character and going on the journey with them, and that's what happens in this movie quite a bit. Another thing in this movie that I wasn't expecting, and at first I thought was gonna sour this entire film for me, is that kind of built into it is very much this conflict between the big city gentrifying liberals and the small town rural conservatives. And there's a fine balance when you bring that sort of element into a movie like this. This movie very easily could have slightly leaned in either direction and it would have soured me on the entire movie, but it really found that balance. Here's what I mean by that. I live in one of the most further out suburbs of Austin, Texas. Austin is very much big city liberal, and then Texas itself is very rural conservative. And what I thought this movie got right was capturing how each of those two groups misunderstand and misinterpret the other. But it also felt like the movie understood that conflict. It understood each of these groups and doesn't turn them into stereotypes. They treats both groups like actual humans with feelings, emotions, and backstories, prejudices and biases that lead them to wrong conclusions about other humans. And this isn't like the overarching theme of the movie. It just makes sense with the plot and the story that they were telling. And in a totally different direction, this movie puts the massacre in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The kills are nasty and gory with broken bones, blood spraying everywhere, chainsaws cutting through people, Leatherface just brutalizing humans. And there's in particular one sequence that really gets literal with the massacre aspect of this franchise. You know, this series has been going on for about 50 years, and I just watched all the movies. There hasn't been a sequence that gets as massacre as one of the sequences in this movie. And so given that there's a little bit like a 50-year tension of like really seeing a chainsaw massacre, there's something very sickly satisfying in watching what Leatherface does in one of the sequences in this movie. And the final thing I think you have to talk about with this movie is that it is a legacy sequel. It ignores all the previous sequels and continues on from the continuity of the original film 50 years later with Sally, the final girl from that film, returning in this movie. And so there's a lot of chatter on the internet of how this would be handled. Is it just another Halloween 2018? And I would say I thought the way that they used the character felt about right. Which is to say, she's not Laurie Strode, a character that we spent a lot of time with in the franchise previously. She was just the final girl of the original film that was very much a visceral experience where you went on this journey with her, but you didn't get to know her all that well. And this movie respects that. And essentially what it does is it treats it like the original film happened in the real world, in which case there's news coverage of it, the police had investigated it, and she's a human that 50 years later is haunted by this thing that happened to her in the early 70s that has been spoken of greatly. And that's the context in which her character exists in this continuity. And so she's an important piece of the story, but she's not the main focus at all. I thought that felt about right. Once again, I'm brand new to this franchise. I have no deep ties to the character. And so the way they did it made sense in light of the continuity as a whole and fit into the story that they were telling. So in general, for me, I didn't go into this movie with high expectations. I wanted a good horror thriller B-movie, and that's what I got. I got some thrills, I got some nice setup payoff, and I got a legitimate Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And the final act of the film is filled with satisfying moments from what Leatherface does, as well as the surviving members of the cast. I dug the film. but this is very far from world-class cinema or groundbreaking horror, so let's move on to the bad. And when it comes to this movie, I kind of had two bigger problems and a few smaller problems. And first big problem is, I'll call it the Leatherface problem. What I mean by that is, in the original film, Leatherface was this very memorable character that shows up that's unsettling, creepy, but Leatherface was just one member of this family. He was the muscle, he was the one with the chainsaw, but it was in the context of all of these other terrifying, creepy people. It was an ensemble that created that atmosphere. And as the sequels went along, all of a sudden the franchise started to put more and more focus on Leatherface and ignoring all of the other family members. And I think something was lost in the process of that, where Leatherface is just a new Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees stand-in, rather than the thing that made Texas Chainsaw Massacre distinct is that it was this family. It just makes it feel more generic when Leatherface is no longer the muscle for this family filled with creepy, weird people that do talk. He's just another masked, hulking killer with a signature weapon that doesn't talk, just like Jason Voorhees, just like Michael Myers. Creates a sameness factor to it. And the other big problem here is the sameness factor, which is to say, we've done a lot of these sequels over the last 50 years, and when you have a premise as simple as Texas Chainsaw Massacre, there's never a lot of layers to the story, they're not character studies, you're gonna start repeating certain plot beats, certain elements. For example, basic concept of this film. Oh, it's a sequel to the original that ignores all of the other sequels. Yeah, they've done that before, multiple times actually, in which case it just feels familiar. And it's lost a lot of the distinctives that made the original Tobe Hooper Texas Chainsaw Massacre films stand out and have a unique flavor to them. As a Fede Álvarez produced horror thriller, I think it does deliver that experience. It doesn't necessarily deliver the unique Texas Chainsaw Massacre original experience. From there, some smaller things that didn't really bother me, but they might bother some of you. One of them is that this movie very much frequently sacrifices logical credibility for the sake of a cool shot. There's one where someone is crawling under a house and Leatherface is using a chainsaw to chase her, and the whole time you're thinking, you could just roll to the side, chainsaw cutting through the floor. Not maneuverable. There's a number of options for what you could do there. It's a cool shot, it's a cool moment. Doesn't make the most logical sense. Likewise, there's this bus sequence that at first was like, oh man, this is crazy. But by the time you start getting to the end of it and they start showing all of the options for perhaps what people could have done in that moment, you go, wait a minute. I feel like we sacrificed a little bit of logical credibility for the sake of trying to deliver the scene that you wanted and all the visuals that you wanted. And I don't think they fully lined up with the logic of the actual situation. And then another one of these smaller issues, obviously a lot of people get killed all throughout the film, and there's several times where people essentially sacrifice themselves for someone else. And I wish that several of those moments had a bit more impact on the outcome of the story and the plot, where they do something dramatic and it kind of in a slight way changes things a little bit, and I think it would have been more satisfying had those actions moved the needle, helped other people just a little bit more. And lastly, I didn't like the specific note that they left the film on. I can't go into more specifics than that. I understand why they did what they did. I don't feel like it was earned or actually fit this franchise and what has been established up to this point in time. Real quick before I give you my final thoughts on this movie, be sure to join me down below in the comment section. Let me know, what did you think about Texas Chainsaw Massacre? And let me know that context. Are you a big fan of the franchise, or are you brand new to the movies just like me? Once again, when it comes to this review, I'm brand new to this franchise, and I am someone that likes these Fede Álvarez horror thrillers. They're very much my thing. Also, I will have a Texas Chainsaw Massacre ranking coming this weekend, and one of the cool things about it, I did shoot big chunks of it on location where 4 of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre films were filmed. I'm very excited about this video because I've never done something like this before. Hope you enjoy it as well. In closing, I thought this was one of the better films in the franchise. It's not great cinema, but it delivered the experience that I wanted. The thrills, the horror, the nasty kills, as well as just a bunch of great, satisfying moments, in particular in the back half of the film. And I liked the way it balanced tackling both big city people with rural people and how they were written. And so for me, I had a good time with this movie while acknowledging it's probably not going to be for everybody. It's a B overall, a 7.5 out of 10, and if you like the Fede Álvarez brand of horror, it's worth checking out. Remember, coming this weekend, I will be ranking all of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre films, and I did a vlog about me visiting 5 different shooting locations from the franchise's history. If that video is out, the video will be right over there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.